Judy Berman, who's managing our tech. She's our tech support for tonight, among other things. And also thank Majean Daniels, who always does the publicity for these, without which we would never have the wonderful crowd that we have tonight. I do have a piece of news, and that is that we are going to record this session, and we will be posting the recording both on the Village website and on YouTube. So as you think about asking questions, remember, these are for posterity. That also means, though, that we really must be vigilant about muting ourselves when we are not talking, because we want the best, if we can, of the recording. Another announcement as we begin, and that is the next session will be March 8, and it will be Tamara Copeland, and talking about growing up as a Black girl in Richmond and being the first, and how being a first is affected by race, and how philanthropy can help us understand better how to move toward racial justice. So that's March 8, and fittingly, it is International Women's Day, which I think is particularly appropriate.
Trudy, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I just add that if somebody is not comfortable being recorded, you can turn off your own video, and you can also change your name or erase your name. So I just say that in case anybody is not comfortable with the fact that we are recording. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Could I use your name, Judy?
The other thing
Do you mind?
Peter?
Sorry.
Okay. The other thing you can do is you can always put a question in the chat box, and Judy and I will try to keep watch on that. So if you don't want to read your question, we'll pick it up from there. So tonight we have with us Karen Branan. I think many of you know Karen, and you may know her from her memoir, which I'm sure she will talk about tonight. She grew up in Georgia, went to the University of Georgia, and has spent the better part of 50 years as a freelance reporter. So she's got wonderful writing skills. And you may know that the Village has a new group that is going to be talking about writing memoirs. So if you are part of that group or interested in it, listen carefully, because Karen's presentation will have some tips for you. Karen also found out by writing a memoir that you get some surprises along the way. And if you're writing a memoir, you have to be prepared for those surprises to come and how you're going to deal with them. So without more, let me give you Karen Branan.
Thank you, Trudy. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and I appreciate you turning out. Actually, I did not set out to write a memoir. I didn't even set out to write a book of any kind. On this particular journey, I set out to find out why I was having night after night after night of nightmares about an impending birth of a racially mixed granddaughter. Because I had been doing civil rights work, doing racial justice work for all my adult life. I felt that I did not feel that I was racist in any way. And yet when I discovered that my senior in high school son in Minneapolis and his girlfriend, who was Black, were expecting a child, I went into a tailspin. And I began to have nightmares that were so terrifying, having to do with life and death things involving Black men with guns coming after me, and just things I'd never dreamt and that didn't make any sense. Now, I did still have a mother and 3 aunts still alive in Georgia who were very racist and who would not have taken well to this. But beyond that, and that was a problem, but that did not warrant these kinds of nightmares. And so, but before that, 2 years before I learned of the birth of this child, I had done an oral history with my grandmother in Hamilton, Georgia. And she was approaching 90, and she had taken to her bed, thinking, that it was going to be any time now, even though she wasn't particularly sick with anything. I think she was just ready to go. And I had been I taught women's labor history for a number of years at the University of Minnesota, and I had been doing a lot of oral histories all over the state of Minnesota, and I just loved doing oral history. So I thought I'll go back down there and do an oral history with my grandmother. And at the end of the interview, I asked my grandmother, "What was your most unforgettable memory?" And without batting an eye, she said, "The hanging." And then she explained to me that a woman, and 3 men had been hanged. She didn't use the word lynched, downtown, out of doors in Hamilton. And that she had been told not to go, that she was a girl, but that everybody else had gone. So she had gone and seen these bodies hanging. Now, she didn't mention race, and in the South, if any of you are Southerners, I'm sure many of you are, you know that nobody tells a story that has race involved, that you don't learn who's white and who's black. So I just assumed that everybody was white. She said they were moonshiners, they had been found guilty. So other than the fact that it was out of doors and a woman was hanged, and I didn't bother with it. And then 2 years later, I learned of the grandchild, and I began having these nightmares. So what I have done is I have distilled my book into a few pages, because even I did not call the book, thank you for your accolades, Trudy. I actually didn't call the book a memoir. I think a lot of people think of it as a memoir, but I really thought of it as a history. So actually, I'm now writing a memoir, and this is a little piece of, to just kind of get the reader of my new memoir into what this story is without having to read the book before they read the next book. And the title of this essay is History Comes. In the beginning, the history wanted me more than I wanted the history. It came for me as a brown grandchild kept secret from her racist great-grandmother, as nightmares that sent me screaming through the house, as a ghost at the end of my bed on Capitol Hill. "Go home, find out what happened," said the ghost, a Black woman. And so I did again and again over heartbreaking decades. In the undertow of emotion, my reporting skills faded. It fell to nature, to dreams, fiction, animals, elders, to serve as guides. Ancient mariners, toothless and blind, anxious to unburden, caught my eye as I roamed country roads. Most would turn out to be kinfolk, or kinfolk of former slaves, of kinfolk, or both. Each were pieces of my puzzle. I was there to learn of a lynching, but first I learned of liaisons. I knew that 4 people were murdered, that my great-grandfather, the sheriff, had on orders of the mob fled in advance, and that my grandfather, his deputy, oversaw it all. I wanted to believe the newspaper stories I had unearthed, a dispute over rents, but was open to anything other than what my cells already knew. As a child, I saw patterns. I believe God made 2 of each person, I told my mother, one white, one black. "Don't talk crazy," she replied. The toothless Black woman told of white bachelors who frequented Black women's cabins, first in the yard, then on the porch, then inside. She named names, told me which white man fathered which Black children, named her own third great-grandfather, the one whose name she bore, an ancestor of my own. Black people know a lot about us, I told my mother, the sheriff's daughter, during a visit. "I don't want to know what they know," she replied. I drove searching for a cemetery deep in a forest. On the verge of defeat, I braked as a stag deer bounded suddenly over my car. There before me lay the red clay path. At the cemetery, red thistle flowers beckoned me to the tombstone of a third great uncle, James B. Moore, cracked open wide enough to enter or exit. The pieces were coming together. In the courthouse, I reached for a heavy burgundy ledger, which tumbles off the shelf untouched and lands open to a page titled Certificate of Indenture by James B. Moore, 1868. The document tells a long secret story of this farmer and his former slave, indenturing her 7 mulatto children, promising to educate, discipline, clothe, feed, and provide them a decent future. These words leap off the page, "as a father would." I am riveted to those words. Only then do I recollect the name of one of the 4 people. A woman, 3 men, 1 a minister, hanged high and shot to ribbons that midnight of January 22nd, 1912, beside Friendship Baptist. John Moore, barely an adult. From the courthouse window, I spotted the Confederate statue on the square facing north, rifle at the ready, erected not simply to honor the fallen, but to glorify white supremacy, a belief which had suffered severely in those post-war years as miscegenation flourished, populist biracial politics threatened, and the die-hard Confederates refused to acknowledge loss. Quote, "The soldier will remind our men to remember plantation manners," wrote the local editor. 1 year later, 4 innocent Black people who had opposed those plantation manners for how they savaged Black people were dangling from a tree. Slowly, I came to understand that this midnight massacre, so carefully concealed within my family, was not only about my family, but about the American family. In coming years, I would, like the ledger, fall off my shelf, open to the right page. Like the deer, I would startle drivers into seeing the path, and like the red thistle, beckon the blind to the open tomb. The book I would write, the DNA I would cast into the world, and my ongoing outreach would over time bring many in my castaway family together. Just before Christmas 2019, 5 cousins, 3 Black, 2 white, all Moors, gathered at Friendship Baptist to collect soil we imagine holds memory and hope. We carried the soil to Montgomery, Alabama, poured it into 4 jars inscribed John Moore, Loduska Crutchfield, Jean Harrington, Reverend Burl Hardaway, then joined the jars with thousands more at the Peace and Justice Memorial to proclaim a long hidden truth and to become a beacon of hope for a beleaguered nation. That's it. So.
Put this back on.
So I had a hard time once I discovered my story. It was hard to get the story because obviously stories like that aren't like splashed all over. There were stories that were splashed all over papers all over the country, actually, all over the world, actually. The International Herald Tribune had it on its front page. And I first saw the newspaper articles at the Library of Congress right down the street. And I was stunned when, the first thing I saw was my mother's maiden name was in 3 of the headlines on the front page. And I had no idea, from the way that my grandmother had told the story, it had nothing to do with us. She didn't mention our family. She just told the story. So when I saw my mother's maiden name splashed all across the front page of the paper, I began to think, oh my God, this is a big story, and this is the kind of big story that I was always looking for and wanting to do. But could I do that to my family? Could I do that to my family? It was such a horrible thing. And I thought of how hard my mother had worked to move away from that kind of world and to move away from that kind of family and to try to be a better person, even though she, like almost every white person in the South in those years, was a racist. But she was a more civilized. She would never have gone to a lynching. She would never have been, screaming at Black children who were desegregating previously white schools, that kind of thing. So, this is why so few of these books get written, because nobody wants to hurt mama. Nobody wants to, mess up the family name. So it took me a long time to decide to do it. And I went back and forth, and I had a lot of therapy, and I, had to find a voice. That was the hardest thing. I didn't want it to be an angry voice. I didn't want it to be a guilty voice. I wanted it to be a straightforward journalist voice. I didn't really even want to be in it that much. And most of my drafts, it was written as if anybody was writing it. I was simply the narrator. And I think I had to do that to be able to stay with it as long as I did. I had to be the journalist. But I had an editorial assistant at Simon & Schuster who was about 21 years old. And she kept saying to me, every paragraph, she would call me and say, but how did you feel? How did you feel about that? The reader will want to know how you feel about that. And, she was like a gnat in my face. I just, I kept batting her away. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be in this book. I didn't want to talk about my feelings. I didn't even want to feel, to tell you the truth. I really had to armor myself in a way that I'm only beginning to realize I had armored myself in order to go down there. And I write in the book about how I kept finding myself halfway on the road back to Washington in my old beat up Toyota, not even realizing that I had left town, because I would just get so overwhelmed with the horror of it all. And it wasn't just the lynching. There were many, many other things that I was having to discover and eventually wrote about. So anyway, in a nutshell, what did this have to do with this little girl that was coming into my life, my granddaughter, whose mother was African American and whose father was European American? And what was this all about? Well, the lynching was about interracial sex. The lynching was about more than interracial sex. It was about interracial relationship. It was about interracial family. As I pointed out with John Moore, the youngest man who was lynched was a cousin of my family, going back to slavery. Dusky Crutchfield, the first woman to be lynched in Georgia, who was lynched with the 4, was had been kind of coerced into a relationship with another cousin of mine on my father's side of the family. And she had been going around actually calling herself Mrs. Mobley, which was his last name, and pretending to be his wife, just as a way of getting him, just as a way of dealing with what he was doing to her. She was an incredible woman for 1912. One of the men lynched was a minister who had been speaking about what these four had been arrested and jailed for was killing the sheriff's nephew. And the sheriff's nephew was a womanizer who chased young Black girls. So he had been chasing the girlfriend of his Black cousin. I mean, this is all family. It's a total all in the family story. And it's about sex, and it's about children, Black children that were being either killed or rejected or sold down the river. So all of this was totally new to me. All of this was totally horrifying to me. That this was a big, huge secret splattered on front pages all over the world years before I was born that I was never told about and stumbled across and came across. So I knew at the point that I learned this, I was still keeping my granddaughter, who was at this point about 5 or 6 years old, secret from her relatives in Georgia. And I saw that I was doing in a much more civilized way what was a family pattern, which was rejecting Black children, which was, hiding Black children. At best, they were sent in the South, they were sent north to go to college. During slavery, they were sold off if it was too obvious who they belonged to. There were all kinds of ways that these children were rejected, and I was doing the same thing without realizing what the family pattern was. I was protecting my grandchild from her great-grandmother. So I decided I had to quit doing that. So I quit doing that. And I went home and with pictures at that point, because I didn't know how my mother was going to react, so I didn't dare take my granddaughter down there. I showed her the pictures. And I said, this is your granddaughter. And she said, and why have you kept her from me? And I said, and I told her, and she said, well, when will I meet her? When I want to know her? And they fell in love with each other. I mean, it was that part of this story is a very happy ending. They fell in love with each other. And it did not matter to my mother what her race was. She could have cared less. She never even brought it up. So the whole time that I was working on this story, I was looking for descendants of the 4 people who were lynched, and I couldn't find them. But I knew once the book came out, somebody would come forward. And they did. So within the first year that the book was out, which was 2016, I got an email from a woman named Jackie Irvine. And she said, I have such mixed emotions. I really don't know where to begin. But I've been sitting on the beach at Rehoboth reading your book. And I thought, oh my God, what a book to take to the beach. She said, and I discovered that I am related, probably to you, but definitely to John Moore. And I'd like to meet. So Jackie and I met, and Jackie, they're 4 sisters. They all grew up less than 5 miles from where my sister and I grew up. When we met, we are distant cousins. We've matched DNA, which was a big relief for me because in some ways it was really almost kind of stretching it for me to say I was kin to the man that my great-grandfather lynched a man that he was kin to. I thought it was so. Everything, I was 98% sure, but I was never really positive until our DNA matched. We grew up close to each other. We have very similar backgrounds. We've been interested, we have very similar educations, interests. She was head of the urban education department for about 30 years at Emory. Her sister is a professor of law at AU, Angela Davis. She's still there and she's doing some of the best training of the new breed of prosecutors, mostly African Americans. And her work has been devoted to criminal justice. She had just published a book called Policing the Black Man, which she wrote with her friend Brian Stevenson, who founded Equal Justice Initiative. So it was just this amazing alchemy of sisters who came together, and we did dig soil and we did go down to EJI, and we've been great friends ever since. So I wanted Jackie to be here tonight. I invited her, Trudy invited her, but she couldn't make it. But I'd like to read a little short piece she wrote, because on January the 6th, when all hell broke loose at the Capitol, she and I both were we were both being traumatized. She was being traumatized in a much different way than I was being traumatized, but we were seeing elements of that 1912 lynching reenacted in the most sacred spot, one of the most sacred spots in the United States. And she wrote a piece which I think is either being published or has already been published in Medium. I don't know if y'all are hooked into Medium, but it's an interesting online magazine. And she titled it, "I Just Watched My Ancestors' 1912 Lynching on TV." 5 years ago, when reading Karen Branan's book, The Family Tree, I discovered that my great-grandmother's 21-year-old cousin, John Moore, was lynched on January 22nd, 1912, on the grounds of Friendship Baptist Church in Harris County, Georgia. John was one of 4 innocent people falsely accused of murdering a white man, the local sheriff's nephew. Among the 4 was Georgia's first female lynching victim, a woman who was lynched because she refused to testify against the innocent Black men. The 4 victims were hung from a tree and shot with over 500 bullets. The woman's tongue was shot through. John Moore and the other victims were dumped in an unmarked grave somewhere in Harris County. Soon, fearful Black residents moved away, including my great-grandmother, who left for East St. Louis. Finally, in 1930, 18 years after the lynching, a white man on his deathbed admitted he murdered the sheriff's nephew. Over the years, I have thought about this horrific event and imagined what it must have been like: the mob, the sounds of the crowd, the shameless desecration of human beings. On January 6, 2021, when I turned on my television and saw an angry mob of armed white people storming the United States Capitol, the dreaded memory of that 1912 lynching all came back to me. I only had to rewind the video 109 years back to that cold January day in Harris County. Like the Georgia lynch mob, this 2021 mob of Trump insurrectionists included so-called upstanding citizens, police and their family, military personnel, elected and appointed government officials, teachers, community volunteers, and devout churchgoers who believed their country was threatened by the other. The 1912 and 2021 murder scenes took place on hallowed grounds, one at the Black Church and the other at the United States Capitol. Like the 1912 lynch mob, the 2021 rioters wore their insignia and carried the Confederate flag, ropes, zip ties, guns, and knives. They even hung a noose from a scaffold they constructed. During both time periods, the mobs arrogantly flaunted their white privilege, unafraid of consequences or punishments. Both mobs stole souvenirs. The similarities of the two events sent me into despair and rage. 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, and hypocritical politicians who promoted discord for years and enabled terrorists now call for unity and healing. I am not persuaded. There cannot be healing without justice. From slavery to Jim Crow to the present day, African Americans continue to suffer because of racist acts and institutional racism that have never been adequately addressed. Lynch mobs of the past, like the one in Harris County, were never held accountable. Many of the white supremacists who attacked the Capitol will never be punished. No superficial plan to unite America along racial, class, geographic, or cultural lines will solve America's colossal divide. If solutions fail to punish the guilty and address persistent structural inequalities and racial disparities in education, employment, housing, healthcare, and the criminal legal system, there will never be systemic change. I suspect without these efforts, I may see a sequel to this lynching nightmare. So I could say a lot more, but I've given you a lot to think about. So why don't we open it up for questions?
Carrie, you're in the picture. Let me remind people to tell who you are and ask your question, and then mute yourself again, please. Thank you.
My name is Susan Sarfati. You were just, all your conversation and your reading has been absolutely mesmerizing. So thank you so much, and I can't wait to read the book. I volunteer at the African American Museum, and when it opens again, I hope that your book is in the gift shop and bookstore. And I don't know if you pursued that. This is my question. Why did the 1912 lynching get covered by newspapers all over the world when lynching was certainly not that rare?
Well, I think because of the woman. I think because of the woman, there were not many women. There were maybe overall 100 women overall lynched, but not that many at that point. Probably, that's interesting. I hadn't thought to see how many there were at that point, maybe a dozen, if that many. Because there were 4, lynchings usually didn't include a lot of people at one time. So I think it was about quantity and gender more than anything else. But lynchings got covered all over the world. They were, that's a whole nother subject. I can't say how much, but I was surprised. I was surprised to see that. And I was also surprised that this particular lynching was not covered in a uniform way. In other words, they didn't pick up sort of the standard white newspaper explanation for it. There were a couple of mostly white newspapers in the North that were owned by NAACP founder. I can't remember his name right now, but he's a white man who helped to found the NAACP, which were much more progressive white newspapers. So they looked into it a little bit more, and then the crisis the NAACP's crisis looked into it a little bit more, and then other white newspapers started in other parts of the country started to pay attention to what some of these were saying, i.e. that they were innocent, that the 4 people were innocent, that it had to do with sex. There was some mention of that, not a lot, because it was just such a, taboo subject, period. But, this, yeah, so That's a good question, and it's really something I can't answer. That what were they just singled out as a special case for all that publicity? I don't think so. I think that there was just a general kind of fascination in a lot of countries with any way that the United States did not live up to its ideals, did not live up to its. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
My question is, hello, my name's Leo Surla. My wife and I live on Capitol Hill at Lincoln Park.
Hi, Leo, you're a neighbor.
Great. My question, and maybe I sort of missed it in your explanation, but your interest in checking on the 1912 lynching was because your grandmother mentioned it?
Yes. My grandmother mentioned it, but not as a lynching. She answered my question, what's your most unforgettable memory, by saying the hanging. And then she described it in a way that it sounded as if it were just a weird way of dealing with white people's crimes. So, you know, she said it was legal, that they'd been found guilty. She didn't mention that they were Black. So when I began to have nightmares about this Black grandchild I was about to have, I remembered that story, and I thought, I wonder if that was a lynching and not a hanging, not a legal thing. And that was when I began to pry into it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Peter?
Hi,
Oh, Judy.
can you hear me now? Oh, I'm sorry. You were going, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Judy, you go first, okay?
Okay, Judy Canning here. Oh, I just wanted to say, Karen, I just finished reading your book. It was powerful. I am reading Cast at the same time, and both books refer back and relate to each other greatly. It was fascinating to me to learn that the Black families that were involved with your family had been in that area for generations. It wasn't just the whites, but the Blacks also. I was surprised how many Blacks stayed on the land, and many of them worked for the white families who had owned them previously. I think that surprised me. And then the sexual relations, how young white men assumed they could frolic with Black women. That whole picture that you painted there was fascinating to me. So I urge everybody to read the book. It is truly powerful, and I keep thinking about it. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Judy. Peter?
Karen, very, very moving presentation.
Thank you.
Can you say more about, I think you were with Random House when you had a 21-year-old assistant asking you how you feel. And I was trying to deal with that when I wrote my memoir. And I had exactly the same initial feeling, that is, the hell with the feelings, let me get the story down. But through therapy, but also through presenting parts of this to high school and college audiences, people would ask, how did you feel? And I'm wondering how you arrived at a place where you felt more comfortable expressing your feelings.
Oh, that's a great question, Peter. It's so hard to answer, though, you know, because it's so incremental. At what point can I say that, you know, that day at the Carter Presidential Library when so-and-so came up to me, and I don't know, you know, I know that people who heard me speak right after the book came out and have heard me several years later say there's been a sea change in your willingness to open up and be really vulnerable about this. And I think it's just it's practice. But it was the fact of doing it. It was the fact of doing it that made all the difference. It was the fact of finding the information, going back and back and back, that kind of persistence that I was building. I was built. It was strange because I had to have several layers of thick skin to do it, but at the same time, I was also getting closer and closer and closer to truth. And the closer you get to truth of your own life, the stronger you are, and the more, and at the same time, the softer you are. I don't understand how to talk about it in psychological terms. I can just say that I began to see that I was raised because of racism. I was raised to be a very hard person. And even though I worked in the field of racial justice all my life, I remained a very hard person in terms of of letting myself have relationships, especially with Black people, I mean, I had to admit that even though I had lots and lots of, quote, Black friends, I was scared to death of Black people. And not for the reasons that that a lot of us are, because of what I suspected, but didn't know and wouldn't let myself find out. I mean, of course, my mother was terrified of Black people. I mean, given the fact that her own father had killed so many, unjustly. Once I began to just like spit it out and say, but I had to have footnotes. I mean, that's how I was. I was a journalist, so I had to have proof of all of this. And once I got it, then I felt safe. I felt like, okay, I'm safe. Nobody can challenge this. I'm not just kind of the stereotypical white Southern guilty person. I'm a journalist who can prove this happened. And then I could just put it all down and say, I remember the first time somebody asked me how I felt this had changed me. I said, well, in my feelings about race, my dealings with Black people, and my work around civil rights and social justice, it's as if a boulder has been rolled away. I mean, there was a boulder between me and that work. I could always leave it. I could always walk away from it. I could always go into, environmental work or feminist work or healthcare work. I can't do that anymore, because it's opened my eyes, not only to my family connection to history and to this, but also to how race is embedded in every little piece of our lives and our society. And if January 6th didn't demonstrate that in, massive, painful ways, nothing did. So if you don't care about race, you at least care about democracy. And it's sort of like I've always said, this is, it doesn't have to be about race, but race is the key way that democracy has never been able to flourish, and it's about to be lost if we don't get a grip on it. So I don't know if it's something I'm still working out, Peter, in this real memoir that I'm writing. I'm still working on that, how did I get able to bring myself into the story? Yeah. And I think the other part is just the reception. This is an important part, the reception, because so many people are wanting to do the same thing and are doing the same thing. And so finding, for a long time, I just felt like I was the only one out there doing this. It was just too weird. And then, as I began to open up and give talks, and people are coming forward and saying, and now, every day I get 5 or 6 emails saying, I'm trying to do what you're doing. Could you give me, that kind of thing. So just knowing that I'm not alone has made a big difference.
Thank you for your courage.
Thank you, Peter.
I
Pat.
feel like,
I thought I saw Pat, I'm sorry, I saw Pat and then Carolyn.
okay.
And are you talking about me, Pat?
Yeah, Pat, you go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, Karen, for your courage in sharing this story, and your talk has indicated how just what a painful and introspective journey this has been for you. And in a certain sense, I feel like you did the journey that we should be doing now. Because I agree with you. I think the cancer in our country that gave us Donald Trump and has mutilated so many of the things that we thought were steadfast institutions and behaviors of the American soul all center around racism. And to me, the riot was about white supremacy versus democracy. And that is the center of our country. And that's the work that we have to do. And I just thank you for this talk tonight, because it's illuminated for me sort of what I've been going through with the riot at the Capitol, and with all the things, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of my work, I'm, as you know, 82, so I grew up in not the South, but in a segregated society. And I just don't think any of us realized how important the not facing this cancer in our society has been to our country, and it's led to the point we are at right now. And I agree with you. I think unless we can root this out and address it, that we will not have a democracy. Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate your talk.
Thank you, Pat. I think Carolyn was next, and then Fran.
Okay, I feel like your granddaughter is an important part of this story. And so I want to hear about when you first met that granddaughter. I hope you did. And how your relationship is with her.
Well, thank you for asking. My granddaughter is now 32 years old. And in June, on my 80th birthday, she will have her first child and my first great-grandchild. And it's a completely different reception this time. No bad dreams, no nightmares, just pure, unadulterated joy. And Fallon and I have been very close since the day she was born. She and I have a wonderful relationship. Not always hunky-dory. I mean, we've had our differences, but we're very close. I have a part in my book. She in the summers, she would come and stay with me here on the Hill. And we taught each other a lot, and this was a great place for her to be, because she was growing up in a mostly white suburb of Minneapolis. And so she learned a lot about Black history here in DC. And we were, when she was 8, we were at the Jefferson Memorial. And I was reading the quotes, all those eloquent, high-minded quotes to her on the wall. And her face got clouded over. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "He was a slave owner." So we sat down and we talked, and she was just adamant. She didn't want to hear any of my hair splitting BS. I mean, it was just, he was a slave owner, Grandma, get it. And I said, well, you do know that you have both slave owners and enslaved people in your history. And she said, "I know, and if I ever have to choose, I'll choose the slave." Okay. And I said, in writing my book, I had to make choices all the time about what to say and how to say it. And I became, Fallon's mantra, choose the slave, choose the slave. And that's what I try to tell myself every day, is choose the slave. What's going to help the former enslaved person best in this thing. So yeah, thanks for asking. She lives in Denver. She's married, and she's a software developer. She's doing things I don't understand, and I'm doing things that she doesn't understand, because she wants it to all just be over. She thinks that this whole race thing is just a bunch of hooey, and has a hard time wrapping her head around it, quite frankly. She wants everybody to just forget about it.
Exactly. Nice, thanks.
Fran?
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. Karen, I think you've been active in this group Coming to the Table. And could you just say a little bit to the group about that, that organization, that group?
Sure. Speaking of Thomas Jefferson, when I first started this work, my research, I needed some people to talk to. I needed people who were kind of doing the same thing, and I thought the internet was pretty new. But I put an ad, I went searching. I searched the internet for something like white slave owners and Black enslaved descendants finding each other, something. It was like almost like a dating service. I was looking for people, and I found Coming to the Table, which I'd never heard of. And they were founded by descendants of Black and white descendants of old TJ, Thomas Jefferson. And some were descendants of George Washington, and some were descendants of some of the other, but they were mostly the big slave owners. And I got in touch with them, and they were having their first gathering in Mississippi at Tougaloo College in a few days when I contacted them. So I went down and I met them, and it was kind of like people feel when they finally decide to start going to AA. You've come home, you've found your tribe, and I had found my tribe, and it was incredible. So here were all these people that had been searching for their matches. The thing I said about there's a Black and white one of each of us, and so you found there were all these little groups, that were families that were Black and white that had found each other in various ways. And So now, it's a much bigger deal than that. There are thousands of people. There are like 40 or 50 chapters around the country. They're not chapters. And it's a very loose kind of group. And they use a circle approach, and they meet maybe once a month. And there are 4 or 5 around. There are none specifically in DC. We tried one on the Hill. But most of the people who were coming, if this was years ago, at the time were from the burbs. So they all went off and started their own. And there needs to be one here, but in the meantime, there are Zooms. So if you want to just try out to come into the table, and it's not just for descendants of slavers and enslaved. There are all kinds of people. And it's basically to talk about race, and people get involved. Some of the groups have action programs. Some just lead people to Surge or Black Lives Matter or something like that. So yeah, that's if you just go to comeintoTheTable.com or .org. I can't remember which it is, and they've got great stuff. They've got meditation groups, they've got study groups, they've got a website. Yeah, it's a good group to plug into. Thanks, Fran.
Good thing.
That's
Say
it.
something. Say something.
Hi.
Say hello.
This is Peggy. Hi,
Hi,
Karen.
Peggy.
Peggy Rainwater. A few months ago, I wouldn't have said this, but I will say that I'm a proud daughter of Georgia. I grew up in Atlanta. I'm interested in what kind of reaction you've had to your research and your writing from your neighbors and family in rural Georgia.
Well, I grew up in Columbus, which is, sort of a city. I've had a lot of different reactions, nothing as terrible as I imagined, quite frankly. When the book came out, I wanted to have a memorial service for the 4. This was before Brian Stevenson. There's this whole lynching memorial movement now, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. It was kind of going on a little bit before EJI opened the lynching museum or memorial in Montgomery. But now, there's a whole kind of process that towns and cities go through to recognize these things and to do reparations and all that. And I was a little naive and didn't know, it never occurred to me. I just wanted a service. And I had been trying to get the churches to have a service even long before my book was out. I just wanted, every time January 22nd came around, I wanted to see a recognition of what had happened there. And I could get no response. I mean, they wouldn't even answer my letters or emails or calls or anything. So when the book was about to come out, I talked to the mayor. I called the mayor of Hamilton, and she was very excited, a white woman who had been high school history teacher. She was very excited and, got things moving. And 2 days before the service, they called it off and they wouldn't talk to me. It was just like a message on my machine. And this had already been in the paper. So all of Columbus had been alerted to this thing, and I couldn't get anybody to talk to me. It was like, the minister of the Methodist Church said, my congregation won't allow it because you have said bad things about their ancestors and how ancestor worship is in the South, maybe everywhere, I don't know. So we had it anyway, I just said, I'm not going to back down on this. I'm all dressed up and ready to go and got my little speech and got my, so I called the librarian, and because the librarian had driven to Atlanta, the first talk I gave was at the Carter Presidential Library. And the librarian had driven up there and bought 6 copies. So I thought that was a good sign. So I called her and said, would you like to become an outlier in Hamilton and let me have this thing in the library? She said, oh, I'm already an outlier. Just, sure, come on down. She said, you just can't have any religion in it at all. And I said, oh, that's no problem there. So we had it, and a lot of people came, and out of that, an organization, a biracial organization was formed that has actually done a lynching memorial for another lynching. It gets very complicated. So we can memorialize lynching victims in Harris County that don't still have descendants there to defend the mob, ancestors. It's crazy. In Columbus, where I grew up, that's a whole different story. The way they deal with it, I'm still on a listserv with all my Columbus High School class of 59, so I use that outlet as a way to kind of preach to them, and nobody ever gets back to me. It's just like, we're too polite to cut her off the list, but we're too appalled to, say, to be able to get with what she's saying. So the way they deal with it is silence. My own cousins, I've discovered all these white cousins that I didn't know I had back then, whose families had actually left the South for the same reason I left the South, but long before I left. And so I've got all these progressive white cousins that, had been living elsewhere. And they're just, they can't get enough of this, and they're feeding me more information. And, I'm really able, one of the things that I'm most interested in is how this background, how this history affects us today. With the whole kind of science coming out about epigenetic, the way that trauma is passed down through the generations. And I have a chapter in my book called Enslaved by History, talking a little bit about the high rate of suicide and alcoholism and drug addiction, divorce. I mean, every dysfunction. We've got all the ACEs, as they say today. We've got ACEs and ACEs and ACEs.
Well, Karen, let me say thank you so very much. I know we could go on for another hour or two. This has been a wonderful, wonderful hour with you. Thank you for writing it. And to everybody who is on, please join us again on March 8th.
Trudy, is there going to be any?
Sorry, I'm sorry, Trudy, I cut Trudy off there. I was trying to unmute everybody and I muted Trudy. I apologize. You were saying that the next event, Trudy, and then I cut you off. I apologize.
The next event will be March 8th. It will be Tamara Copeland, a Black woman who grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and is going to talk about being a first and what it has meant as far as racial equity in the United States. So join us again, March 8th, International Women's Day. Thank you all.
Thank you all. And if you want to unmute yourselves and say goodbye and have a round of applause for Karen, you can do that too.
Right.
Wonderful.
That was great. I really learned a lot.
That was wonderful, Karen.
Thank you. And thank you, Trudy.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you for organizing this, Trudy.
That's great.
Good to see you all.
Okay.